I think perhaps if we go over to the map here, I can indicate to you why it is so vitally important. Here is Indochina. If Indochina falls, Thailand is put in an almost impossible position. That indicates to you and to all of us why it is vitally important that Indochina not go behind the Iron Curtain.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam, and we've got our difficulties there, quite obviously.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That'd be a great mistake.
Would you give us your appraisal of the situation in South Vietnam now since the coup and the purposes for the Honolulu conference?
Well, because we do have a new situation and a new government. We attempt to assess the situation, what American policy should be, what our aid policy should be, how we can intensify the struggle, how we can bring Americans out of there. Now, that is our object, to bring Americans home.
Is there any speed up in the withdrawal from Vietnam?
Well, as you know, when Secretary McNamara and General Taylor came back, they announced that we would expect to withdraw 1,000 men from South Vietnam before the end of the year.
In a new book, JFK and Vietnam, military historian Major John Newman offers his conclusions about Kennedy's Vietnam policy.
I don't think there's any doubt that JFK was pulling out of Vietnam when he was killed. And I think because the most fundamental tenet of his policy was no combat troops, and we know that Johnson put in combat troops, I feel it's safe to say that the assassination led directly to the escalation of the war.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died.
Ah!
He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 017, Dr. John Newman on JFK and Vietnam. Our guest tonight is author Dr. John Newman, and he'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. But first, a little cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page is at Midnight Rider News Show. That's Midnight Writer News Show. And if you haven't done so yet, please like us on Facebook because it's the best way to get up-to-date information on what we do. So our Twitter is MWN_ST Patrick, and our email is midnightridernews@gmail.com. And let us not forget that first and foremost, we are a website that uses original writing to combat the historical establishment. For our valiant efforts in that area, please visit us at midnightridernews.com. Now, it seems like, so far, that our Facebook pages are up and working, but who knows how long that'll last? After all, it is Facebook. So we're having severe issues, however, raising funds for our JFK conference in Dallas this year. So if you could help us by donating on midnightridernews.com, we would really appreciate it. It's our intention to do live updates from the conference itself. So to be honest, we need a lot of help here. We're trying to raise enough for the conference fees, the hotel fees, the travel expenses, and the exhibition materials. Our goal is to raise this before the end of September, and we're estimating it's going to be between $500 and $700. So we do need help. and we need it pretty quickly. So if you could help us out, we would really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And we'll be right back with Dr. John Newman. It was a day which will live in infamy. But what do we really know about Pearl Harbor? In episode 007, we talked to Doug Horn to find out what FDR really knew and when, what documented evidence we have of FDR's foreknowledge, and what it all meant for the future of World War II.
Hi, this is Douglas Horn, author of Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. If you want to know the truth about FDR, Japan, and the real path to Pearl Harbor, listen to episode 7 of the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Dr. John Newman is a retired military intelligence officer who served for 2 years as military assistant to the director, General William Odom, at the National Security Agency. His groundbreaking 1991 book, JFK in Vietnam, proposed the thesis that President John F. Kennedy had intended to pull out of Vietnam. The updated and expanded second edition of JFK in Vietnam was released in January 2017. Newman re-entered the JFK case in 2013 with the publication of Where Angels Tread Lightly, The Assassination of President Kennedy, Volume 1. Volume 2 of Newman's series on the assassination, Countdown to Darkness, was also released in 2017. His experience and expertise as a cryptologic analyst make his qualifications and credentials unique among those who have chosen to delve into America's hidden histories. Dr. Newman is an adjunct professor of political science at James Madison University. For the past quarter century, his work has overturned orthodoxies, broken new ground, introduced new facts, and produced revelations about America during the Cold War era. We're honored to have him with us tonight. How are you this evening, Dr. Newman?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me on the show, ST.
Now, it's really an honor for us to have you on. So we're such fans of your work, JFK in Vietnam, especially the newly updated and expanded edition that was released earlier this year. Let's begin with a little overview of what the situation is in Vietnam and what it entails when President Kennedy takes office in January of '61. What sort of situation is he inheriting in Southeast Asia and especially in Vietnam?
Well, I could talk about 10 hours on that, but I'll make it a little shorter. There's two main things I would mention, and number one is a mess in Laos. The Eisenhower administration had made a really big mess in Laos, and the issue was, before Kennedy, when he came in, was whether or not to go through with CETO Plan 5, which Eisenhower was thinking about doing. CETO is Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, United States and France and Britain and some Southeast Asian countries. Anyway, 500,000 guys, 500,000 soldiers would have had to be sent to Laos to straighten the thing out, according to the Pentagon. Kennedy didn't want to do that. He wanted to neutralize Laos. In Laos, and the other is Soviet strategy and the Vietnam War and/or Laos. In the mid-1950s, Mao Zedong, who is the supreme leader in China, People's Republic of China, decided to start breaking off a friendly relationship with the USSR, which at that time was in a leadership struggle, Khrushchev versus Malenkov, which Khrushchev was getting the upper hand in. And so that ended up pitting Khrushchev against Mao. And as Khrushchev solidified his position, the relationship between Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev deteriorated, and so did the relationship itself. And it was between the two countries, and it became later known as the Sino-Soviet split. So Premier Khrushchev came up with a plan, and it was right out of Stalin's book at the end of World War II, when there was a difficulty with China back then, and the way that Stalin handled the problem was to foment the Korean War, causing, as Mao said, we have to lean to one side. They needed Soviet help to fight the Americans in Korea. So making a war on the Korean Peninsula solved the problem of Mao walking his own way in what, at that time, the USSR really felt they were in charge of the entire communist bloc and everywhere in the world. Khrushchev's strategy was to do the same thing. He was going to foment a war in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, and suck the Americans in. He didn't want to bring in the entire military weight of the United States in one fell swoop. That wouldn't do the trick. What he wanted to do was to draw us into a containing position on the southern Chinese border and have the Chinese and Americans slowly but surely back into a war with each other. And then they'd have to come crying, the Chinese would have to come crying to Moscow for help, to defeat the Americans, and then they'd have to get rid of Mao. That was the strategy that had been in play since about 1957. And the North Vietnamese knew it, and they understood that what Khrushchev was up to, but they felt that they could go ahead with his strategy because they could play Moscow and Beijing off against each other. And so the sleeper cells, Vietnam had been divided in 1954, and the French Republic crashed over a number of things, including its trying to hold on to its colonies in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So by about 1957-58, Ho Chi Minh, over the objections of Lao Dong, that was the Communist Party in Vietnam, North Vietnam, they decided to reactivate some of the sleeper cells that had been left in the South and start sending numbers of soldiers down what later became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And by 1959, there were military clashes with Viet Cong units in the South that had indigenous communists in it, but also some more experienced soldiers from North Vietnam. And in 1960, when Lansdale was sent, Edward Lansdale, our famous psych warfare one-man show, was sent to find out what was going on. He had been friends with Diem and had stopped 2 coups from overthrowing President Diem of South Vietnam. He was sent out to see how bad it was, and he came back in late 1960 with the news that it was going to hell in a hack. It was the first document that Rostow put on Kennedy's desk after his inauguration. And as I say in the beginning of the book, JFK in Vietnam, Kennedy looks up at Rostow and says, "This is the worst one we got, isn't it?" And that was true, but neither Rostow nor him or anybody else understood the strategy I just laid out for you, that Khrushchev wanted us to go in there. And in the Laos situation, which was really hot in 58 and 59, the Soviets had provided aircraft and pilots, an airlift to airlift lots of North Vietnamese into Laos to topple the pro-American Phu drug-infested operation. And so that was going on. And the pilots did not practice any secure radio silence. They talked in Russian as if they wanted us to hear them. It was a provocation. They wanted us to see it and to know it. And of course, most of the people like Alan Dulles and the guys in the Pentagon were, belly aching to go into Laos with a great big force. There's an overt mess in Laos, but there's also a dark shadow that nobody understands for quite a while about why what's happening is happening, and that they really are trying to draw us in. The Soviets are trying to draw us in to solve their China problem. So I'll stop there. I think that's inheriting plenty on Vietnam when he takes office.
Oh yes, he absolutely inherited quite a tangled situation. Now, did President Kennedy's views on Vietnam evolve as he moved through the course of his administration, or was he always opposed to escalation in Southeast Asia?
Well, he's evolving over time, but not for escalation. He had a big problem in Berlin, which if we get into that, we could end up doing 4 or 5 shows. But we didn't have the sufficient forces that were actually, divisions and ground divisions and airborne divisions and aircraft and ships to take on the Russians on the continent. They would have had a big upper hand in terms of numbers of forces and tanks and things like that. And so Kennedy was worried about that, and that's one of the reasons he wouldn't go into Cuba. But he wouldn't go into Vietnam either. And in fact, he didn't go into Vietnam until the end of 1961. And the reason for that is because he was still worried about Berlin. And he had called Khrushchev's bluff in Berlin. The Soviets were trying to push the West out, and Kennedy basically locked and loaded all of our nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union and called Khrushchev's bluff, and there was a big tank standoff in Berlin, and the Soviets blinked, and they withdrew theirs, we withdrew ours. The price that Kennedy had to pay for that was the Berlin Wall, So with the Berlin crisis sort of subsiding, or apparently subsiding, he decided to go into Vietnam with advisors. And that was in November. To the day, 22 November 1961, NSAM 111. NSAM is a National Security Action Memorandum. It's a presidential directive. And they had been arguing all year long about whether to send combat forces, U.S. forces into Vietnam. I have chapter after chapter on that in the book, so I can't go into all that now, but just trust me that he turned them down every single time, from early in the year all the way through the fall. He sent Taylor over with express instructions to go over there and look around and come up and recommend against combat forces. Taylor disappointed him by coming back and recommending combat forces under a flood relief task cover. JFK was so angry with Taylor about it that he planted false stories in the New York Times that Taylor had recommended against combat forces. We have the documents now. They were released in the Pentagon Papers, so we know that this happened. But he drew a line in the sand right there. That's where the line of sand was. He was told, and after NSAM 111 was promulgated, and we were going to send up to 16,000 advisors. There was a ceiling of 888, which is the old Geneva Accords, which we weren't going to be able to go along with, and didn't. And a lot of, military equipment, helicopters for mobility, and armored personnel carriers, and some tanks, and artillery pieces. It was a big step up. And unfortunately and tragically, exactly what Khrushchev wanted. Not a huge conventional American move into Vietnam, but it's certainly an increase in the American commitment to Vietnam. Having said that, though, every time the issue came up, he wouldn't go for it. And during the course of 62, there was a huge lie that was concocted. I'll get into this a little bit downstream, but they attempted to keep him from pulling out early, the advisors that he had just sent, because if they had ever told him what they found on the battlefield, he would have. There were only three options in Vietnam. We go in there with our forces and topple the communists in the South and North Vietnam too, if they don't stop, or we help them with advisors and equipment, or we just pull out. Well, option one is off the table. There's only two options left: advise and support, or lead. And so the truth was suppressed about the size of the Viet Cong, the actual operations going on the battlefield from the very beginning, especially in spring '62, to stop Kennedy from pulling out right then and there, which is what John Kenneth Galbraith told him he should do, by the way, and that made everybody quite angry. So the point is, the first point to your question, he always opposed U.S. combat forces. And at the time that this began in '62, the Joint Chiefs sent a real stink bomb over to him. But McNamara didn't sign it. He let Kennedy see it. They told him that, we told you once, we told you twice. You've got to send conventional forces into Vietnam. If you don't do it, it's going to make it much worse. Everything from Tokyo to New Delhi is going to go down the toilet. That's really what it said. That's what it boils down to. The whole free world in the Far East is going to fall. They said nothing short of 6 divisions could fix that. Now, that's interesting because it's in that context, that dire context, he says no, right? It's not just a small thing. You're telling the president, if you don't do this, the whole free world is going to fall. I guess the only stronger argument you could say, Mr. President, you got to do this because we're coming across the Rio Grande. So understanding that is important because the line was drawn in the sand on that right at the very beginning. His first really big decision on Vietnam was in November of '61, and that was NSAM 111. And the saying that went around the Pentagon and everywhere was, we can have everything we want but combat troops. So the situation involves lots of things during the next 2 years in 62 and 63, which really isn't part of the question you're asking, so I'm going to jump to the end. So the decision comes, inevitably. He finds out the truth and decides to use it to his advantage. Oh, are we winning? Really now? Good, then we can come home. And he knows it's a lie, so he's playing now too, all right? It's a judo move, and they don't like it, and they know it, and there's a McNamara-Taylor trip towards the end in September of '63, and Taylor had the same job. Again, actually, it was McNamara's job. He knew he could trust McNamara to recommend withdrawing the advisors, 1,000 by the end of the year, and everybody out by 65. It was a huge catfight in the White House when they got back to that one. So the only thing that evolved in his position on the war was that he was going to withdraw the advisors that he had put in. He never would have put in combat forces, to answer your question very succinctly.
Vietnam has always sort of reflexively been known as a bad war, Dr. Newman. But why? What were the problems that no military could resolve, and why couldn't it be won?
Principally, the reason why it's so bad is if you've ever gone to the wall down here in Washington, D.C., it's not like war memorials in Europe. You know, people meet there for lunch, and the kids bring the soccer ball, and, yeah, I'll meet you at the war memorial for lunch today. You know, they sit around, and they're sitting on these places. There are names around the memorials of the dead soldiers and stuff, and it's not, nobody's crying. It's not a sad thing anymore. But when you go down to that wall, it's eerie. It's alive. People just touch it. There's great reverence going on. And you know, there's nothing like that for the Korean War or for World War II. There are memorials, but there's nothing like that place. And I think it's because it's not over, because and that's why my book was suppressed. They still don't want people to know, especially people who have it in their memory, what the truth is about that war, all of the lies, and why it was so important to lie. I mentioned it briefly in the previous question. I'll draw it out a little bit in a little bit more detail here. It has to do with what we say in military officers understand as counterinsurgency doctrine. Now, we're probably, for a long time, the best experts in insurgency because that's how we defeated the British. And Mo Green and those guys down in the Carolinas were harassing and hit-and-run operations and nibbling away at the British strength. Later on, by World War II, we became, across the plains of Normandy and all that, the tanks and open warfare. But we were up against the very thing that we invented. Mao Zedong studied the American Revolution. And so counterinsurgency doctrine is, you have to understand why it is correct. Because when you're up against insurgents that can go hide in the jungles and come out when it's to their advantage, when it's a small unit or there's not much for it, is a self-defense unit doesn't have real people, but it has weapons, things like that. The good guys, right, the friendly force, in this case would be us, our advisors in the South Vietnamese Army, it ties down half of all the good guys in static defense. They have to defend the cities. They have to defend railroads and roads and communications and weapons depots and all those things. Half the whole force is not available to fight in the offense. It's all defense. And so the remaining people in the force that are available to fight the insurgents have to have a 10-to-1 ratio. There have to be 10 soldiers for every insurgent soldier. Because in the defense always kills more than the attackers. And so you have to have 6-to-1 to 10-to-1 in any situation, even if it's not an insurgent. That's just the nature of offensive military operations. So the South Vietnamese Army was about 150,000, and they were having trouble increasing it to 170,000 because of a lot, not just guys dying, but guys going over the hill and joining the other side, defecting and deserting the South Vietnamese forces. So with that force ratio, which everybody's on record, by the way, I got Kennedy, I got McNamara, Rostow in their articles here or there, that everybody, and some of them actually argue 20-to-1, but anyway, 10-to-1 is the minimum you'll ever see in American counterinsurgency doctrine. So if you have 150,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, the size of the force that you can contain would be 15,000 BC, main force units. Well, unfortunately, by the time we get to the end of 61, they're already bigger than that. There was when MACV was created, that was part of NSAM 111, part of that NSAM, to create a new combat headquarters, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. They started having, there was a big fight in the White House. Kennedy was upset with his people in the State Department and the CIA over the Bay of Pigs and Berlin and other issues. And he fired a lot of people. In the book, it's entitled The Thanksgiving Day Massacre. It was Thanksgiving Day in 1961. And he also fired the top 3 guys at the CIA, although he kind of blurred that a little bit by letting them stay in their chairs for a little bit here and there so it was less visible to the press. But everybody who had been fired was ordered to attend the meeting, and all of their replacements were ordered to attend the meeting too. And so they're all sitting there, and then Kennedy comes in, and it's real short, sweet, to the point. You get with my policy or you get out. And I want one man responsible for being in charge of implementing my policy. Now, who's it going to be? And McNamara puts up his hand and says, I'll do it. So McNamara goes out to Honolulu, and where the Commander-in-Chief Pacific is, and over to Saigon, the MACV headquarters, about once a month. They call them SecDef conferences, Secretary of Defense conferences. And around the third one, something really weird happens. Instead of all this horrible pessimism, the ambassador, Nolting, he gets up there and says, we're winning. We've only put a few advisors in tents at Saigon Airport. And just a few weeks before, everything in the whole Far East was going to go down the toilet. And so I call that the sudden reversal in military reporting. And I also call it the beginning of the optimistic interlude. It ends just 2 days before Kennedy was killed in 1963, this lie. But anyway, the third conference, McNamara is a numbers guy from Ford Motors. He's waiting for Colonel Winterbottom, who's he's MACV intelligence chief, and he's a SAC bomber, doesn't know anything about ground counterinsurgency operations at all. He gets up there and he starts putting up slides, and McNamara wants to know how many VC are there. And he puts up 3 different slides, everything from 12,000 to 30,000 Viet Cong. And McNamara says, why don't we know how many? He was worried because he'd seen 2 estimates where they had grown by about 8,000 in the previous 6 months. And so Winterbottom says, well, we don't have good order of battle people. And at that time, Len Nitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all the other generals wanted to jump up and strangle him because we had plenty of good order of battle people. He just didn't know anything about order of battle. Anyway, but it was too late. McNamara got very upset and said, I want a list of all the people around the world before I get on my plane tonight. And so they jerked people out of the Assistant Chief of Staff Intelligence in the Pentagon, and the newly created DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and Army guys from the United States Army Pacific, and sent them over to bolster the already new beefed-up intelligence shop at MACV. And they were literally pulled right out of pack your stuff and go. And so by late March, they had all showed up, and they're going to go through Vietnam's 44 provinces and do an estimate of the Viet Cong in every one of those provinces, especially the hardcore Viet Cong. And it's ready for about the 5th SecDef conference in early May. And the figure these guys came up with was 50,000 hardcore Viet Cong forces. Well, if you applied a 10-to-1 ratio to that, what size South Vietnamese army do you need? 500,000. And so General Harkins, the MACV commander, ordered Winterbottom to cut the figures. That just was unacceptable. And so these guys who confessed to me when I was right, and we can get to that when I get to the questions about how JFK Vietnam came about, their role in cutting those figures. They tried to oppose it, and they were just ordered to do it. So they got a bottle of bourbon one night, and Saigon sat down and went through the OB, the order of battle, and just took half the troops out, just cut them out. Well, that took it down to 25. That wasn't good enough. So they're put under house arrest till McNamara comes and goes. These guys who weren't from had to go back to their jobs. So Harkins and Winterbottom cut it down to 16,000. Well, that's about the size that South Vietnamese Army can handle. So you see, it's the lies that make this war so bad, and why it couldn't be won. The advisor option was stillborn. So the only option left on the table was withdrawal, and they would not let JFK know the truth because he would have withdrawn. That's why.
It really is heartbreaking that the only real option on the table was the last one that President Kennedy's own national security state was willing to present to him. Now, this leads me to the question of influence, Dr. Newman. How did Kennedy's relationship with his own CIA and Joint Chiefs of Staff influence the policy decisions and direction in Vietnam?
Well, it was just as bad, if not worse, before the story we're talking about now, because when you go to the Bay of Pigs, we'll get to that in the next section of questions, it was terrible what the Joint Chiefs did and what Allen Dulles did. Terrible, terrible, terrible lies. They knew they were lies. And the reason they lied, because they knew JFK wouldn't do what they wanted him to do. And so they had to manipulate him into doing it. I don't have the time to do, there was a manipulation on Laos. They got JFK to blink. I can't go into the details now, but it's in the book. But that gave them the idea, well, if we got him to blink on Laos, which he didn't do for very long, but he did for a while, we can make him blink on Cuba too. So the plan was, and I'm getting a little bit into the next section, but it's pertinent here. The plan was in the Bay of Pigs to make sure that exile force was being slaughtered on the beach. They wanted men to die. They were sure, even though Kennedy had told them otherwise, that he would change his mind and send in the Marines and the Air Force. But he didn't. But they were manipulating him because they realized that he wasn't going to go for that. And so they had to trick him and put him under tremendous pressure to do it. And they're doing the same thing in Vietnam. Well, they're actually they manipulated Eisenhower too. Some of these generals did. And Eisenhower was furious when he found out it was about Cuba, manipulation over Cuba. So what does Kennedy do about it? He fires them. He should have fired them all. It wouldn't have been firing. He should have just brought his own people into the Pentagon and CIA. Nobody would have considered that a firing. That's done all the time. But he let them stay on. Now, he brought in a whole new team on economics and domestic policy and all that, but for some reason he let the Pentagon and the CIA stay in place. And I know that he must have been very sorry for that by the time he got into 63. And by that time, they were all gone. He fired them all except for one, General Shoup, who liked Kennedy's policies. So it's an amazing spectacle, actually, a president so isolated and being lied to consistently in all these different areas.
Mainstream historians confound me often, and many mainstream historians have said that it's a myth that JFK had intended to withdraw from Vietnam at the point when he was assassinated. Now, your thesis in JFK in Vietnam is that he was planning to withdraw the advisors and was against providing South Vietnam with combat troops. So, can you please make this case for us?
Yeah, first of all, he wasn't just planning to. He had already issued the order. That's NSAM 263, National Security Action Memorandum 263. Was actually the order itself was made on the 5th of October, but not actually put into writing for several days because he wanted to keep it secret. But it leaked, of course, to the Pentagon, and they had leaked it to the New York Times, so it was in the newspaper. So George Bundy said, Mr. President, as long as we're reading it about in the newspaper, can we please put it in a document? Yeah. So they did. And we have that NSAM. And we have the minutes of the meeting in which it occurred and the one before that. We have the minutes. Those were released, by the way, in the early 90s with about 6 months before I had to go to gallows on my book. So I was very fortunate to get all these. It wasn't just those documents, but many thousands of documents on the Kennedy years in Vietnam were released at that time. I interviewed with George Bundy, who was right of center, but he was very faithful to Kennedy, and who authored NSAM 263 and authored both versions of 273, which happened just before and after Kennedy's assassination. And the first version, which he wrote after attending one of the SecDef conferences, and which is where the end of the optimistic interlude takes place, he's writing a draft NSAM 273 for what he thinks is the president who's going to be alive to read it. And that NSAM recognizes that the war situation is deteriorating. We needed to intensify the war effort. But it's very specific that the way we're going to do that is by augmenting and increasing the resources of South Vietnamese forces, period. And that is something that the President Kennedy could have signed up to that was consistent with his policy. Well, Kennedy dies on Friday. On Sunday, Kennedy's body is in the casket in the rotunda of the Capitol building. And George Bundy comes by to show the draft NSAM that had been written for Kennedy to Johnson. And Johnson orders the key paragraph that restricts intensifying the war efforts to South Vietnamese forces to be completely thrown out. 2 big slash marks for that. And I said to Bundy, I said, who told you to do this? He said, Johnson did on Sunday. I had an interview with him, and he's the one, and I've got the marked up versions of this stuff. So there's no doubt that Johnson, within hours of Kennedy's death, reversed that NSAM. And the specific reversal, if you're a war planner in the Pentagon, the text of paragraph 7 tells you can have anything you want. There's no longer any restriction on American intervention in the war or attacking North Vietnam. And he put General Krulak to work on it right away. And the first naval raid against the coast of North Vietnam was away in January, and the next one in June is what brought about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, a blank check for the president to do anything he wanted in Vietnam. So that's the facts. But if I can just wax eloquent here for a minute, I want to go back and discuss the other part of your question, which is, what the hell's going on here? With these historians and all that. It's really clear that from the record, the declassified record, that Johnson reversed Kennedy's policy in Vietnam, and that Kennedy would not have reversed his own policy. That proposition is very, very flimsy, if you ask me. And so the burden of proof shouldn't be with me. I've proved my case. You got to prove to me that why Kennedy would have reversed his own policy in Vietnam. Anyway, time and again, the same men who later advised Johnson to send in the troops were the ones who asked Kennedy to do it, and he never wavered in refusing. Even though confronted with these undeniable facts, the proponents of the notion that Johnson continued JFK's policy attempt to build their case on the argument Kennedy would have eventually dropped his opposition. Now, it is not surprising that the continuity proponents ignore the fact that Kennedy ruled against troops in Vietnam, not just when he was in a position of political strength, or when the argument could have gone either way, but it was in 1961, like I described to you, when he had suffered twin losses in Cuba, and he was told that the failure to send combat troops would be the loss of that country and everything from Tokyo to New Delhi. So this long resistance in American academia to accepting this simple truth was, and it still is to the extent that some people still adhere to it, it's an anachronistic and an embarrassing outgrowth for the apologia for American intervention in Vietnam. The notion that the bad dream of Vietnam might not have been is not only unattractive, but also painful. The extensive documents and interviews of JFK in Vietnam especially outraged the more extreme commentators from both the far right and far left ends of the political spectrum. Noam Chomsky on the far left said that my book made a saint of Kennedy. And Colonel Harry Summers on the far right said I had vilified Kennedy beyond the wildest dreams of his worst enemies. The caretakers, the original caretakers, the JFK LBJ Vietnam continuity thesis, they were originally prominent mainstream academics. And for a time, until the turn of the century, the continuity thesis easily survived efforts to counter it by men personally close to Kennedy, like Arthur Schlesinger and Theodore Sorensen. The argument that Kennedy would have held the line against combat troops has always suffered from the unpalatable implication that the Vietnam nightmare may have been avoided. And so the burden of proof is therefore tended to rest unfairly with those who advance that argument. The facts pertaining to the classified record of Kennedy's decisions were not released until the early 90s, just as my manuscript was in its final stages. On a fundamental level, a significant part of the problem, though, is the duplicity of President Kennedy himself. It's a duplicity overlooked by many of JFK's supporters because it detracts so much from his image, and overlooked by the proponents of the continuity thesis precisely because it destroys their argument. There is no question but in the main, Kennedy's 1963 press conferences gave the impression he was unwilling to lose in Vietnam. The truth, however, and what the declassified record clearly shows, is that Kennedy was preparing for, and in fact had begun, a withdrawal from Vietnam when the battlefield situation was desperate. McNamara eventually came out in support of the arguments in JFK in Vietnam. He wouldn't say anything for 30 years. Everybody else went on record, but not him. And other distinguished authors have now begun to do so as well, like James Galbraith, Peter Dale Scott, Howard Jones, and many others. In JFK in Vietnam, I advanced the argument that the contradiction between Kennedy's public anti-withdrawal statements and private pro-withdrawal statements was deliberate and designed to conceal his willingness to withdraw in the face of defeat. Kennedy's ability to conceal his true intentions until the time of his own choosing was dependent upon McNamara's cooperation. In telling the military that the 1,000-man withdrawal would occur if the situation allows, McNamara was covering for his boss, President Kennedy. What I had not seen when I wrote JFK in Vietnam the first time was the extent of the evidence that McNamara was indeed fully prepared to execute a withdrawal in the face of a battlefield defeat. And that story is in his oral history at the Pentagon. Now, that oral history wasn't released until just a year or two ago. But I found out about it. I just need to tell you this little anecdote here, and we can move on. I found out about it when I saw a book by Deborah Shapley, who was just a newspaper reporter in Washington. And she walked into McNamara's office and requested to see it, and he gave her permission. She was the first person to ever lay eyes on it, that hadn't had a need to know. McNamara and the interviewers. He put a top secret classification on it, wouldn't let anybody see it all those years. Well, when I found out about it, I got a hold of him, and by that time we had already a relationship, which I'll tell you about in a little while. But I called him. I was angry, that he didn't allow an historian, especially one that was working on the Vietnam War, to see it. They said, all right, you can go see it. So I wasn't going to wait 10 minutes. I got in my car, went over to the Pentagon. I was in uniform at the time, and I went up, and there, the office of the historian Secretary of Department of Defense, and I knocked on the door, and there's, what's his first name? His last name is Goldberg. He was on the Warren Commission, and he wrote some of the Warren Report. His last name's Goldberg, and so I introduced myself and told him what I wanted, and he said, "Oh, no, you're not going to see that." And I said, "Yes, McNamara just gave me permission." He said, "No, he didn't." And I said, "Look, call him on the phone. I just came from there." So he said, "I will." And he did. He called McNamara on the phone. McNamara gave him a direct order to let me see it. So he was very angry with me. He took me into a conference room, a big mahogany table, and gave me a yellow legal pad and a pencil and said, "Here, there's 4 big, thick segments of these 4 segments of the interviews done for the oral history." So I started with the very first package, writing from the very first page, line by line. And about 30 minutes later, I'm left-handed, my left forearm was shot. And so I walked back out of the office. I didn't even say anything to Goldberg. I called McNamara, and I said, "This is crazy. I can't do this." McNamara said, "You put him on the phone." And so he gets Goldberg back on the phone again. And he orders Goldberg to let me have what I want to copy what I want from that oral history. Well, at this, Goldberg angrily says to me, "There's a Xerox machine." He turns around and goes and slams the door. And there I am alone in that room with a Xerox machine and the entire oral history of McNamara for 2 administrations. And it was one of those serendipitous moments, that it's just, there's been a lot of them in my life, but that was a very interesting position to be in, so I copied the whole thing. Anyway, the only part that I really want to mention right now is in his own oral history to the Office of Secretary of Defense, McNamara shed considerable light on this very subject. He said, quote, "I think that early on, say 1961-62, there was reason to accede to DM's request for assistance to help him train his forces. I believe to the extent we could train those forces, we should do so. And having done it, we should get out. To the extent those trained forces could not handle the problem, the subversion by North Vietnam, I believe we should not introduce our military forces in support of the South Vietnamese, even if they were going to be defeated." I guess on this topic now, one more anecdote I want to share here about who President Kennedy trusted with his ultimate plan to get out of Vietnam no matter what. And as I've already said, JFK did trust McNamara, and I believe he trusted his National Security Advisor, George Bundy, as well. But he did not trust everyone in his cabinet. I recall an event that took place in the 1990s when I went on public television in Georgia for a taped joint discussion with former Secretary of State Dean Rusk. We were talking about my book and Kennedy's plan to withdraw from the war in Vietnam. Rusk made a comment in such a matter-of-fact manner that it seemed to me as if he must have made it on many other occasions. He said he did not think Kennedy was going to get out of Vietnam, quote, "because the president never said anything to me about it," unquote. I replied, "Well, Mr. Secretary, I don't think that looks very good for you." The Secretary had no comeback, and we both dropped the subject.
When you were preparing to have JFK in Vietnam published, you faced a lot of undue suppression. Could you please tell us about that, and could you please tell us how that led to the formation of your relationship with Robert McNamara?
When I was getting ready for publication with Warner Books, I went to the Army, as I'm required to do, for pre-publication approval for the book. And I'd done that for my master's thesis, and it was approved, and this one was as well. The approval came at the beginning of 1991. Well, by that time, I had, risen to high up in the National Security Agency. I was actually the military representative to General Odom, the director of NSA, late in my career. And in 1991, I was back in the United States after in Hong Kong. I dropped off a copy of my manuscript to Q Group at NSA. They handled, amongst other things, pre-publication review. The person I handed the manuscript to said they did not want it because I was in the Army and I should submit it to them. I said I did submit it to the Army, but I would appreciate it if you would look at it all the same. She did take it. I left and I heard nothing until many months had passed. About 1 month before the book's publication, I received a call from NSA telling me the publication had to be stopped because my book was classified. I asked the person calling, who I believe was in the General Counsel's office, on what grounds, at this point, were they saying the book was classified. I received no straight answers other than it was classified. I was told they would be in touch with me at some point. This was a bombshell for me, coming as it did just a few weeks before the book's publication. Moreover, I was about to join Oliver Stone in Hollywood, the premiere of the film JFK, and I was to play a prominent role in the press junket the day after that. I had authored several scenes in the movie on Vietnam based upon my book. My security clearances were suddenly threatened if I went forward with the publication. Perhaps my Army career and pension too. My wife, Sue, and I spent many sleepless nights worrying about what to do. I called Stone up and told him what was going on. He sent former RFK advisor Frank Mankiewicz to advise me on how to handle the matter. Mankiewicz had been he was presidential campaign secretary in '68 for RFK. At the time of my call to Stone, Mankiewicz's Washington-based public relations firm had been retained by Stone. Frank was certain that the late timing meant that someone wanted to disrupt the book and the film from having the huge impact that he thought was about to take place. At our second meeting, he suggested that I should visit the Office of General Counsel to call their bluff. I thought that given the NSA position, there was nothing to lose by taking that approach. When I made the visit, the Deputy General Counsel agreed to speak with me. I asked her, what are you people trying to do? Help make my book a bestseller? No, she replied, but we were telling you cannot publish your book. When I asked her for specifics about what was classified, she apologized and said she did not know, but assured me that it was being looked into. Unfortunately, she had no idea when that would happen or when it would all be finished. Well, I went forward with the publication of the book. I attended the Hollywood premiere of the film JFK. It was a huge event. It went well for Oliver, but the night afterward did not go so well for me. I called Sue and we talked about what was going to happen the next day. Of the many technical advisors that helped in the film, I was the only one that Oliver invited to participate in the major press event the next morning. All the other invitees were actors, actresses, producers, directors, and writers. I knew that participation in the press junket was just as dangerous as the publication of my book. In a large ballroom, groups of reporters would move from table to table every 20 minutes, at which only one person was sitting, me or Stone or whatever. And this would go on for hours. I didn't sleep well. But exactly at 4 a.m. on Sunday, the next morning, 7 a.m. on the East Coast, the phone in my hotel room rang. The press junket was now just 5 hours away. Major Newman, the voice of the phone, said, "This is the National Security Agency. What do you want?" I asked. "You are cleared for the publication of your book. There's no problem. I hope you have a nice day." And after about 30 minutes of stunned silence and introspection, I called my wife, and we both had a nice day. NSA was clearly worried. I would tell the press corps they were trying to stop the publication of my book. In the new edition of my book, I discussed the possibilities about what went into that, and that clearly, as Frank Mankiewicz said, someone did not like my book or Stone's film, and we were all going to find a lot more about that. So I wasn't out of the woods yet. The book was published. It stayed in the bookstores for several months and then suddenly disappeared. When I realized this, I started calling Warner Books, and they wouldn't return my calls. And the next thing that happened was that James Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith's son, who's an economics professor at UT, University of Texas, had put my book, because he'd seen this juxtaposition of Oliver Stone and Bill Colby, the CIA director, on the back, the blurbs, put it on a syllabus for a graduate course he was teaching. And by chance, I was asked to go down to this big debate for my thesis at the LBJ school down there at about that time. And his students came to the event and surrounded me afterwards and asked what happened. I told them my book's been suppressed. Well, that got back to Jamie Galbraith, and he called me up. He asked if I didn't mind that his family looked into it. His father and he both were friendly with chairman of Time Warner, Inc., Box. And so I said, sure. They looked into it. They got hold of the CEO, and he said, "It's a scandal. Let me look into it." And so he did. And in short order, I got a phone call from the president of Warner Books asking me how I wanted to handle the situation. Was I going to sue? And I said, no, give me my rights back and we'll call it quits. And that's how I got my rights back to the book, The Intervention of the Galbraiths. So in that story I just told you occurs my relationship with Robert McNamara. And I'll turn to that part now. It was really chapter 13 in JFK in Vietnam that was the beginning of my relationship with McNamara. It's called Secrets in Saigon. It was a significant turning point, not just in the book, but also for me personally, as it turned out, for Secretary of Defense McNamara, too. The genesis of that chapter began at Fort Huachuca, Arizona in 1988, where I was attending the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Officer Advanced Course. The Military Intelligence Museum was located on the base at Huachuca. Before long, I visited the museum to see what I could find. I met the director of the museum, Colonel Retired Don Blasek, who had served in Vietnam during the Kennedy years and later under General Joseph McChristian, the intelligence chief for MACV, during Westmoreland's command in 64 to 68. It turned out that Blasek had worked in MACV's intelligence staff in 62. The first thing he said to me after confirming that JFK in Vietnam was the topic of my dissertation with George Washington, what he said was extraordinary. Quote, well, that's when the big lie started. Unquote. I had seen the CBS documentary called CBS Reports the Uncounted Enemy, a Vietnam Deception, on the lies about the Viet Cong that had been perpetrated by McVie in 1967, but was unaware of how deeply Blasek had been involved. My wife Sue and I listened as he described his experiences in Vietnam and with the CBS documentary team. And then Blasek gave me something that changed my life. The names of the intelligence officers involved in that same sordid, bald-faced lying in McVie that had taken place earlier in 1962. He suggested approaching Sam Adams first. Sam Adams was the CIA analyst who had been the principal consultant on the CBS documentary and who would know how it could reach the officers that Blasek had mentioned. In August of 1988, I visited Sam Adams on his farm in Loudoun County, Virginia. Sam confirmed what Don Blasek had told me about 1962. He provided locations and phone numbers of the most important intelligence officers I needed to interview, including some of the top American military advisors. At the top of the list was Bill Benedict, an Army officer who had been working at the Vietnam desk in Army intelligence at the time, and George Allen, who had been working on Vietnam in the newly created Defense Intelligence Agency. Allen and Benedict had not talked to each other about that unsavory experience in 1962 when they became involved in the Order of Battle Deception, and which became Chapter 13 of JFK in Vietnam. They both told me the same account of the falsification of the Viet Cong Order of Battle. Moreover, the senior American advisor in Vietnam at the time, Colonel Dan Boone Porter from Texas, confirmed that account too. I also interviewed John Paul Van's subordinate, Major James Drummond, who said the same thing, as did advisors Ronald Dutton and Sam Dowling and McVie's infiltration expert, Captain Jimmy Harris. I was stunned. I'm a military intelligence officer, right, at the time. Realizing the magnitude of what all these men had lived through and their need to get it off their chests after so many years, I knew I had to search for something in the documentary record that might confirm their story. That search led me to the U.S. Army Center for Military History, located in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. The Military History Center also had a significant collection of documents at its office in Washington, D.C., located on Massachusetts Avenue. Downtown on Army business, I visited that facility one afternoon, it was the afternoon of 18 July 1988. I was still in uniform when I walked into the center and was met by an Army civilian supervisor. I explained who I was, what my dissertation was about, and that I needed the United States Army Pacific USARPAC monthly intelligence bulletins for 1962, including the map, if it was still available, that was used to brief McNamara at the May 1962 Secretariat Conference. Let's have a look, the gentleman said as he began opening the safes. Here we are, and look, here's the map, too. And right there on the spot, he had the authority, apparently, he declassified the bulletins, what Benedict and the others had called the measles map, which was covered all over with red splotches representing Viet Cong concentrations. Now, the USARPAC intelligence bulletins confirmed the account of what the participants involved in McVie's deceptions had told me, and more. The map showed that in May 62, Harkins had not only cut the Viet Cong strength, was from down to 16,000, but he also cunningly hid from Secretary McNamara the fact that the Viet Cong had just conducted the largest offensive all over South Vietnam of the war to date. Once this part of the story was fully put together in Chapter 13, I decided not to wait any longer to contact McNamara. I called the number of his office and spoke with the secretary, Jeannie Moore. I made arrangements with her to send McNamara a copy of Chapter 13. Upon reading it, McNamara was upset by the details of this chapter, and he refused to talk with me. He did send, through his secretary, a one-line formal denial. I do not think I was lied to. More than 4 years later, not long after the publication of JFK in Vietnam, on the morning of 23 March 1993, I was at my desk at the National Security Agency when the phone rang. The voice said, "Hello, this is Bob McNamara, and I'm ready to talk now." I went to meet him straight away. I was shown into his office. He was at his desk wearing a three-piece gray tweed suit. I could see under the desk that he was wearing a pair of white sneakers. He appeared to me to have some anxiety as he cordially thanked me for coming right away and for bringing him a copy of my book and some other materials. And then an argument ensued. McNamara began by saying he did not remember what he had said in his oral histories, and as firmly as he could stated they had a policy of not discussing Vietnam. And then I pushed back forcefully. While I empathized with the situation, I told him just as firmly that as an historian, I had for years disagreed with his policy of silence. Visibly upset with my challenge, McNamara raised his voice and said, "Well, one reason is that scholars haven't done their work yet. I haven't read your book yet. So we'll see. Perhaps one day I'll make my views known, but I'm damn well going to have a good research assistant to help me, and I figured that wasn't going to be me. As we talked about the Vietnam War, however, it became apparent to the Defense Secretary that I was a scholar in East Asian history and had done my homework on the Vietnam War. During the course of that discussion, we found so many things to agree upon that the rancor dissipated from our talk, which continued with more comments on China before I departed. My first meeting with McNamara was on my mind for the rest of the day. As it turned out, it was on his mind too. My literary agent at the time was Sterling Lord in New York, who was very highly regarded. At the time, I had been working on Kennedy's Cuban policy as a topic for my next book, but suddenly I became more interested in a work on McNamara. So the next morning, I phoned Sterling Lord to report that I wanted to change the subject of my next book. To what, he asked. McNamara in Vietnam, I replied. He said, I don't think you should do that. Why not? I said. Because McNamara just called me a few minutes ago and said he wants to write his own book on that. Happy that I had at least finally pushed the Secretary of Defense over the line and away from the silence policy, I decided to let matters stand where they were. A revelation that became apparent when I scrutinized McNamara's oral history was the change that had taken place in Kennedy's withdrawal timetable. I did not fully appreciate this crucial point when I wrote JFK in Vietnam in 1992. The point is that the 1,000-man withdrawal was originally planned to take place during the election campaign of 1964. However, the Buddhist crisis erupted in April 1963 and proceeded during the summer to knock the political bottom out of the regime in Saigon. At the May SecDef conference, as the crisis was unfolding, May 63, McNamara announced concrete plans to withdraw 1,000 men, not in 1964, but by the end of 1963. In 1992, I didn't clearly grasp the importance of McNamara's use of the term concrete. In short form, Kennedy needed a recommendation to start the withdrawal in 1963, and he needed it right away. He had to start the withdrawal early and had to do it without being publicly associated with the military optimism accompanying that recommendation. Kennedy accomplished that by having McNamara make the recommendation. Kennedy and McNamara steamrolled their opposition in the uproar that occurred when Kennedy made McNamara announce his recommendations to the press on the steps of the White House on October 2nd, 1963. In the third interview of his oral history, McNamara made it clear that both those for and against the withdrawal were acutely aware of the importance of Republican announcements and the concept of concrete. Quote, those who opposed the decision to begin the withdrawal didn't want it announced since they believed, as I did, that it would be in concrete. But fast forward here. Although my relationship with McNamara had begun with a frosty start, things improved to the point that McNamara began inviting me to come to his office on several occasions to help him and his research assistant, Brian Vandermark, who I really like, with the work on his book on the Vietnam War. I brought lots of documents to McNamara that I had amassed over the years at different locations around the country. One afternoon I spent with McNamara during 1994 stands out above the rest. At this session with McNamara in 1994, I recall that it had been quiet for several minutes. All three of us had been poring over a number of documents. McNamara then asked me a question that I'll never forget, not only because of the question, but also because of the apparent subliminal state of consciousness that he appeared to be in when he posed the question to me. Looking directly at me and even right through me, with a blank look on his face, he said, quote, when did I know? This question struck me like a thunderbolt. I knew exactly what he meant. I was aware that, for just a moment, McNamara had allowed his consciousness to drift into a place where events had been repressed, and that this part of him wanted answers. McNamara had just asked me when he knew the truth about the war, when he first knew the truth about the war. I knew how much he had struggled with guilt for so many years, and I realized this was an important, if fleeting moment. I took some time to consider his question carefully before answering. Then I replied, I cannot tell you when you figured it out. However, I can tell you when I think you had ample opportunity to do so. I picked the December 1962 to January 1963 time frame for all the reasons discussed in Chapter 16 of the new edition. Kennedy's emissaries returning with bad news, the CIA taking McAfee statistics apart, and the president demanding access to raw cable traffic out of Saigon. I would just add one little thing here. There's a new revelation that came out of having to rewrite the whole book in the second edition, and that concerns Maxwell Taylor. From the time they got back on the McNamara-Taylor mission in late September, promulgated the withdrawal plan in October, and Kennedy's death, General Maxwell Taylor was doing two things that were disloyal to President Kennedy and keeping them from the defense secretary, too. Number one, he gutted the 1,000-man withdrawal plan in stages, coordinating it with Admiral Felt at the SINPAC out there in Honolulu with people at McPhee and others, but not telling the Secretary of Defense. By the time the Honolulu conference, 2 days before the Kennedy assassination, met, and they had to meet because Diem had been killed, and that was going to require a new presidential directive on policy, there were almost no units left in the 1,000-man withdrawal. And Kennedy had ordered specifically that it had to be units. Parallel to that, General Maxwell Taylor was doing something else, equally disloyal. He was ramping up something called Op Plan 34A. He put it on the table in front of McNamara out there 2 days in Honolulu, 2 days before Kennedy was killed. Op Plan 34A was a huge plan of all sorts of measures, from little pinpricks to unleashing the B-52s against North Vietnam. As I said, while Kennedy was lying in state in the Capitol building rotunda, the paragraph that restricted doing something to turn around the war effort to South Vietnam's forces was ordered destroyed by LBJ. We're talking about hours. And as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, it led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and American intervention in Vietnam. But anyway, that's the story of my relationship with McNamara and why the book was suppressed unsuccessfully. I don't know why I didn't republish it all these years. I guess it was a bad memory, something that my wife and it was traumatic, and I hadn't thought about it for years. And Alan Dale, who's a research associate of mine, and Sue, both more or less at the same time, said, "Why don't you redo that?" So I did, and that's how JFK in Vietnam, second edition, got published this January.
And if any of our listeners would like more information on JFK in Vietnam, where can they go?
Sure, it's easy to remember. My name is John Michael Newman, so the website is jfkjmn.com, jfkjmn.com.
The book is JFK in Vietnam, the author is Dr. John Newman, and the website is jfkjmn.com. Now, due to length, we've decided to divide Dr. Newman's time with us into 2 episodes. The second episode on JFK, Oswald, the CIA, and Cuba will air in October. We want to thank Dr. Newman for being with us tonight, and we want to thank Alan Dale for help in facilitating some of the information used for tonight. So until October, this has been Dr. John Newman, the author of JFK in Vietnam. I'm S.T. Patrick, this is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be back with some final thoughts. On episode 005 of the Midnight Rider News Show, we were honored to have one of the leading JFK assassination researchers on the show. Jim DiEugenio of KennedysandKing.com joined us to discuss his interests into the JFK assassination research community, the case and trial of Jim Garrison, Oliver Stone's JFK, the poor JFK-related work done by Vincent Bugliosi and Tom Hanks, the 2017 JFK records releases, as well as comments on James Files, the Three Hobos, and whether he believes it was Rafael Cruz in New Orleans with Lee Harvey Oswald. Listen to Jim DiEugenio on episode 005 of the Midnight Rider News Show today. In 2017, the Vietnam War remains difficult for Americans. Many of us, embarrassingly, know little about the war aside from the protest music that stemmed from the domestic tensions surrounding the war and its draft. It's quite possible that you may not have learned about the Vietnam War in high school. It's very possible that your well-intentioned teacher simply didn't make it that far in the text. Even if you did make it to the inevitable unit on Vietnam, what did you learn? You probably did well in the terminology and list of names like Ho Chi Minh, Diem, Viet Cong, Saigon, Laos, and if your teacher had some courage, the My Lai Massacre. And with a turning point that was a great murderous lie such as the Gulf of Tonkin, what could we really write on a final essay? But maybe Vietnam is hard to understand both on a macro and micro scale. It's difficult to pull out the maps and track troop movements and strategies in a war that existed everywhere across Vietnam. It existed on every street corner, on every mountaintop, in every convenience store, and in every single place and nook and cranny, in every hut, in every home, in every apartment. It absolutely existed in every dense jungle, filthy river, and thick field. The Vietnam War also existed in every mind and in every heart, but not in unison. It wasn't a war that coalesced the American spirit in the way that World War II did. Vietnam divided households, churches, schools, and friendships. How do you draw that on a map? How do you make a list of great generals in a war that wounded the national spirit in such a profoundly destructive way? How would we ever name our schools after the war's leaders? Can you name any of the victories, or would we rather just forget? The education on Vietnam should not be a study of positions and artillery and supplies. It should be a study in the diversity of leadership and administration. President Kennedy intended to withdraw from Vietnam. He did not support combat troops, and he believed that it was a war that couldn't be won, whatever won means. President Lyndon Johnson then escalated the war far beyond what either Eisenhower or Kennedy had intended and hoped. Vietnam is a study of how Joint Chiefs of Staff relate to their executive. It's a study of the soul of a Secretary of Defense. It is a study of the domestic degradation that can occur from such an international catastrophe. And it is a lesson of falsified statistics and the effect of the mass media. Some joined, some were drafted, some were engaged, some were horrified, some defected, some organized, some tuned in and were turned on, and some dropped out. Many died, and most were changed forever. That is Vietnam. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.